Hi everybody, Thatcher came in from Taste Media Group coming to you this morning. And last week we were really trying to get insight and interview people that were in the moment. So how were they handling almost a day-by-day operations from last week? And starting off this week, we really want to take a much higher level view. And we're very fortunate to have futurist, author, and speaker David Houle joining us, a longtime friend of Taste Media Group from Sarasota, Florida. David, thank you so much for your time here.
It's my pleasure. Always love working with you, Thatcher. You're a great producer and a great synthesizer of content. So, as you know, I always used you for years before I moved down to Florida.
Yeah, no, we appreciate it, David. We did a lot of content kind of when Taste Media Group was just kind of getting off the ground. And so just for people that maybe aren't familiar, take us to how you were viewing the 2010s and as we transfer here into the 2020s, because this was on your radar.
Yeah, so, I am a futurist, and I think in terms of long time frames, and my responsibility to the world is to be accurate about the future. So at the very highest level, as you know, because you recorded a lot of my videos, I came up with the phrase, the shift age, that we've left the information age, entered the shift age. And that was roughly around 2005, 2006. And I forecast it would last to the mid-2020s or to 2030. So the shift age is really the time, leaving the information age in the year 2000, basically, is the shift age between the realities we know it up to 2000 and the reality we're experiencing towards the end of the 2030s. And so then 2010 to 2020, I named the transformation decade, which is a decade where everything's going to change its nature, shape, character, and form. And also that there'd be a collapse of legacy thinking from the past. And the reason I mention that is that it's really that 2010 to 2020 was the first decade of 21st century thought for humanity. And so now it brings us to the 2020s. And as I've discussed with you, I'm writing a series of books about the 2020s because, simply put, as a futurist, it's clear to me, it's become clear to me for the last few years, that to think beyond 2030 is just specious, because this decade, the 2020s, is going to be the most disruptive decade in human history and is largely going to shape much of the century of humanity. So that's the high level at which I look as where we are.
And David, on March 17th, you put out a blog post that can be read on davidhoule.com, and it really broke down your thinking and broke this down into very digestible content in a way, or a way to process all of this. But one of your ideas was that humans are adaptive. Can you kind of explain that?
Well, really, it's, if you think about, one of the issues I always have with audiences, I say you have to suspend your sense of current reality, because reality is transitory and people think that it's constant. I mean, look at the reality that we're living in 2020 versus, say, 2010 or 2005, completely different. So humans adapt. They adapt much more quickly than they think they do. So relative to COVID-19, there's a massive adaptive effort going on to move from what I call the physical reality based on atoms, what we normally do, and the screen reality based on digits, which is mostly what we've become. So that one of the key things with COVID-19 is the adaptation from the physical reality to the screen reality. And we see kind of all innovative things going on. And I've said for years, I mean, back when, a long time ago, mid-90s, when I first got on the internet via T1 line, it immediately struck me that, to speak very simply, everything that existed in the physical world would have to be reinvented on the internet, on the screen reality. So what you're seeing today, 25 years later from that insight, is we're trying to adapt our socialization online because we have to stay at home or be in self-lockdown, whatever the phrase is. And the interesting thing going forward, Thatcher, is how is that going to change behavior? And how's that going to change the physical reality of economics? For example, let's say people have to be sequestered for a month or so, and one of the spouses or partners or friends takes to cooking, and they really get into cooking, and then they've discovered a whole lot of great stuff to watch on streaming. So maybe that Saturday night date in a movie goes out the window because it's like, hey, I'll cook one of my new dishes and we'll stream from Netflix or Amazon, right? So that's going to change. I mean, all the theaters in the United States are now closed. And the question is, the longer this goes on, it's a 20th century business. So we may be adapting to entertainment online and not doing it socially.
And in terms of just looking at the economics of this, David, you kind of, in your blog post, you mention the role of government versus the role of corporate governance. How do you see these two either working together? Does that relationship become tighter? Does it become more distant? Or does corporate America, or corporations, if you would, have to step in more during this time?
Two things. I've been saying since 2015, and a lot of large think tanks and people like the Business Roundtable have come out and supported this, which is corporations at this time, and certainly in this decade, have to step up and face the common good. They have to face the common good because governments are dysfunctional or broke everywhere. So that's one thing. And also the new generations, you represent, I believe, as a millennial, and then the digital natives that are younger really want to make a difference in life. And so they want to work for companies that are making a difference. So I always ask when I speak to CEOs, what is your culture and what are you doing to make the world a better place? Don't just say you're making money, you're pleasing your shareholders, but you're helping Habitat for Humanity and for a week and pay everybody to do that, or whatever that is. But the other thing, more significantly, as I look into the 2020s, one of the four dynamics of the 2020s at the highest level is the reinvention of capitalism and democracy. And it is so coming out. Like last week, it was talking about, the federal government is just not behind this. They're not doing anything. It's happy talk. It's awful. There's no leadership at a time of real crisis for this country and for this world. That's number one. And then last week, the revelation that a bunch of senators who had prior information about how bad this virus was going to be.
Sold the stock, yeah, I saw that.
Sold their stock. I mean, so at a time when people are standing the unemployment lines, and of course the Senate makes all the rules, and they have no rules to restrict them. So the governmental corruption and corporate corruption and price gouging, all this stuff is not going to sit well on the ears of people who are wondering if they're going to be evicted or if they'll have food for their family. So what you're seeing in the COVID-19 is a beginning of what will be the necessary reinvention of capitalism and democracy. And so I look at it through that lens. I don't talk about Trump this and governors that and how far down the recession is going to be. I mean, that's stuff that's interesting, but it's short term. The longer term is this is going to be looked back on, I think, as a fundamental, following Occupy Wall Street, the great wealth inequality. Increasingly, even wealthy people and hedge funds people saying capitalism isn't working. So here you have a fundamental closing down of capitalism and an inability of democracy to protect us. And that's going to lead to significant change in thinking about our relationship to the government. And in fact, last week, it was starting to be floated that, maybe we'll have to cancel primaries, which would make the Democratic candidate less than authentic or acceptable. Or maybe we'll have to postpone the election. I guarantee you someone's going to float that because it's such a time of corruption. So I think COVID-19 is going to be one of those incidents, along with all the social and government and economic and cultural issues. It's going to be an issue about how do we look at democracy, what we expect from democracy, and is capitalism working for all of us?
And David, can I hone in on that? Some of your response there a little bit more. Do you think that, now just to look at the corporate side of it, which obviously is capitalistic in motive, right, in a way, like is corporate America going to become more of a safety net in a way, or operate in just a totally different mindset? Because I've been a fly on the wall for companies for a long time, and it's tough to really not put the motives of shareholders, the motives of the owners ahead of the people at the bottom.
Well, that's all changing. In the last 5 years, there's been a move from corporations working for the benefit of the shareholders to moving to corporations for the benefit of the stakeholders, the customers, the employees, the greater good, and the shareholders. So that's a movement. And, about 10 years ago, the conscious capitalism movement started. So what I'm waiting to see is, the federal government saying, oh, all these masks were available and the ventilators and all that stuff we've come to know too well. And I don't see the delivery, right? And I can't understand why there aren't big corporations who are opportunistically wanting to be the good guys, right? Like, some manufacturing company says, well, I've kept my employees on because we're making masks and we usually make paper goods or whatever it is, right? Or we're last week Elon Musk said that he's closing down Tesla because he was pressured to by the laws of California, and he said it might take him 6 to 8 weeks to retool to manufacture ventilators. So he's the type of guy that will step into that void. So it's also a time to measure corporate America. What are they doing for the people that they like to sell to, they call their customers? What are they doing to support the health and livelihood and benefit and well-being of the people they like to sell product to in this time of global pandemic?
Yeah, David. And then, one of your final thoughts, and you've been on this for a long time too, is just climate change in general. How is that going to be affected moving forward here? And does that become, once we pass this, the next major initiative worldwide at scale versus, the level of the volume of the conversation now?
I think there's going to be a lot more collective thinking and collective action from human beings. I've always, one of the other dynamics of the 2020s is this move to global consciousness. And now that we're all online and we're reinventing it, we're starting to realize that we, the people, we, the connected, we, those that participate in the screen reality, are actually stronger than the old archaic constructs and institutions of the 20th century and the 19th century. Democracy and capitalism were both invented about 225 years ago. Think of anything else that's 225 years old that hasn't had to be reinvented and changed. So it's always been a history of changing capitalism and changing democracy. That's why there are amendments, and that's why there's laws and everything else. And it's the 2020s is going to be looked back on as the definitive decade of this century. And I want to say, if this is the last question, it's really funny because I'm sitting here doing the final draft on the book, The 2020s, and I'd like everybody to go to www.the2020sdecade.com and sign up for advance notice of my book. It'll be published in April. But I say it's the most disruptive decade in human history. Well, look at the first 3 months, right? I mean, how disruptive a time has this been since January 1st? We knew it was coming. We're not prepared. We're all not working right now. We're home. And, I was saying to my wife last night, it's really interesting. I'm going to be different, right? Like when I go out shopping, we don't know how long coronavirus is going to stay. It'll come back next fall, whatever. I'm always going to go shopping with gloves on, right? I'm going to wear a mask, and I'm going to always carry hand sanitizer. And I'm reprogramming my brain right now, so I'll wash my hands 5 or 10 times a day. So, that's back to the adaptability. But as we collectively change, as you do interviews like this, Thatcher, and as I talk, I'm increasingly being asked, what does this all mean? I think I can't emphasize enough how, one, disruptive this decade's going to be, which is writing these books. And second of all, how significant this pandemic will be looked back upon as fundamental change in social behavior, cultural behavior, disruption of government, and necessary change to capitalism.
And David, I actually do have one more question for you here before we
Sure.
depart. But just looking at, obviously what we've gone through here, can you just try to compare it to anything else you've experienced during your lifetime?
Well, it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's a little bit of the Great Recession, and it's a little bit of Occupy Wall Street, where there's a sense of connectivity and no hierarchy. And it's a lot like Earth Day, and it's a lot like Woodstock, and it's a lot like the Vietnam War. I mean, I gave an interview, with Bob Surratt the other day. I think you heard it, where I said that, as a baby boomer, my parents were Depression era, right? They lived through the Depression as young adults or old teenagers, and it have scarred them for life. I think a lot of people, probably people more your age than my age for sure, but millennials and younger people are going to be scarred. This is going to affect their behavior and how they view work and money and what's important in life going forward. So I think.
I'm sorry, David, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so, you look at and the need to mobilize for World War II, but basically it's going to affect consciousness and economic behavior almost as much as the Great Depression because of the intensity of the change that's coming in the years ahead.
And David, you talk about millennials, and I do want to point out that I'm right now sitting here at 37 years old. So I graduated college in 2005, but there is going to be a subset of millennials that graduated in the recession. So their careers were somewhat halted, I want to say 2 to 3 years. It was very traumatic for a lot of those people who are only, let's say, 5 years younger than myself. And now they're going through this again, and depending where we land with all of this, with the economic recovery, to your point, I think there's going to be a lot of people that are in this millennial generation that are going to be somewhat scarred from these traumatic, like you said, it's only good, like our mindset is only, is dealing with this just in 3 months. What else will come to this decade? So we might become a little bit more even not used to it, but just know that anything is possible.
Absolutely. My son graduated from college in 2009, right? So
yeah, exactly.
I say to boomers who have trouble understanding millennials, I go, wait a minute, this is the first generation of Americans who in their adult life, so you graduated from college in 2005. So the last 15 years has basically been endless war and poor economic times, right? So you have a whole generation of American, the first generation in the history of our country to spend a decade of their early adulthood in recession and at war. Never happened before. So of course your generation is going to think entirely differently. And what has always been well researched is that your generation, millennials, do not respect institutions. And there's no reason they should, because the institutions need to change. They're about to undergo change from 20th century structure to 21st century structure. That's what this is all about.
Yeah, and that legacy thinking that's going to have to go out the window, David.
Right.
Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
We'll see how this shakes out. Maybe have you on a couple of times moving forward here.
I'd be delighted to. I think at times like this, as you know, my career really took off in the Great Recession because CEOs said, "What the hell's going on?" And I was one of the few people to give them the larger perspective that they needed. Same thing here. So thank you for having me today, and look forward to coming back again, Thatcher. Thank you for doing this.
Awesome, David. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.